Hello, my name is Audrey Gordon, and I'd like to introduce to you tutorial templates. Tutorial templates will be a new way of finding templates that are focused on learning experiences so that you can learn the core components of Power Automate easily. We're grouping these into different topics, and I'm going to start today by introducing the SharePoint list provisioning template. Now, there are quite a few things to talk about in this template, and I'd like to walk you through some of the dependencies in case you'd like to revise the template and or reuse certain pieces of it in your own flows. Okay, I do want to start by going straight to the template gallery and pointing out that a new way to search right now to find these. It's kind of like an Easter egg until we surface it, but you can just type tutorials. And when you do that, you will see our most recent tutorial templates. We plan to release tutorial templates based on feedback that we get from the forums as to what templates could be useful to you as you continue your learning experience around Power Automate. So different from other templates, these are not typical business scenarios. They're more like learning modules. And so they're showing you an example how you can use functionality within a flow to do different things. And so we're going to start with the center one here. Click a button to get tutorial on provisioning SharePoint list and columns. And so if I click this one, you will see that it uses two connections. It uses the flow button for mobile. So you could launch this from your mobile device. You can also just initiate it manually whenever you'd like. And then the SharePoint connector, which allows you to connect to a SharePoint site where you'd like to provision your list and columns. All right. Now, one thing we are working to resolve is the links in the description are not clickable at this time. So what we may do moving forward is just replace these with bit.ly links. But in the meantime, if you highlight them and then copy, you can just open a new browser and paste those in there. And these are important because they explain some of the dependencies involved in this. And we'll talk about each of these dependencies as we walk through the flow. But you'll see the links to parameters for list creation, base template types, and field types. And I have actually spelled this out in the PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you on the community so that you can actually see these relevant resources and click on them yourself and go and investigate them. Okay, so let's keep going with our flow here. I'm going to press continue. Now, of course, most of you who are using Office 365 will automatically sign in to your typical connections that you use. But if you've never signed into SharePoint, you will have to sign in here, and you'll see this little checkbox will not be there, and it will give you an opportunity to sign in. Okay, so then I'm going to hit continue. And now we brought into the editor where I can revise this flow and learn from it. Okay, now I would start by renaming it to something a little bit shorter than our template. We name these templates rather long just to make sure that you can understand what they're going to do before you open them. But you can always rename this. And so I can name this create lists columns. Okay, so this is a flow that creates lists and columns. All right, so because I have the icon, so if I save this, because I have the icon at the top, this trigger here, we know that this is a manual button flow in our list of flows. All right, now the button here is for convenience. It enables you to launch this whenever you'd like. In most scenarios where you're creating a list and some columns, you would want to decide when you're going to do that. And so that manual is typical. But you could also replace this trigger with something else. You could replace this trigger with a different trigger and then have it triggered by some other event. Okay, that can happen. Just understand that because we're provisioning list and we're provisioning columns, this will not run successfully twice in a row because each site, once it gets that list or that library, it won't let you create other ones. And so you want to be careful not to over trigger this per run, because each run should be for a particular site. And then that's it. So this is often used to start your SharePoint site. Maybe you have some lists that you'd like your SharePoint site to have all the time. You can store some flows that define those lists. All right, so the first thing that's important here is the variable that says replace your site name. So right here, and this is important, you won't be able to successfully run this flow until you've given it a site that you want to put this data into. So I'm going to open up SharePoint here, and I'm going to choose a site from my mini sites in order to run this flow. So I'm just going to use my Flow Studio team site, and I'm going to look at the site contents here. And there are very few sites here, list here. There's only 1, 2, 3 lists here. So we are going to add the run this flow against this site, which means it will get the new lists and it will get the new columns. All right. So I need to go up to the URL of this site and copy that URL. And then I can go back to my flow and drop it in. Now, it's possible at the end of your URL, you have things like list, or you have things like HTML or any of that. You want to stop this URL at the end of the site name. There should be nothing after that site name, and that will ensure that this runs properly. Okay, so maximum thing you can have is a /, but there should be nothing after the name of the site. All right, so that's a big dependency, because this is what's telling Flow where to put this new content. All right, so now that we're done with those, now you'll notice that the entire flow, and I just collapsed everything, is grouped into 3 scopes. And we use scopes a lot when we're doing very long-winded flows, but also when we're doing training, because scopes help us to consolidate things in groups, all right? Groups focusing on a particular automation component, all right? So you can see there's a group here for library, there's a group here for list, and there's a group here for creating the columns in this list. And I have put this in this order because you have dependencies from the bottom up. Okay, so the variable is the most important. There's nothing more important than that. Then the library is really just a nice to have. It's to show you how to create libraries, basically the difference between a library and a list. But then these columns should not be attempted until the list is there. And so the default configure run after applies here. This one will not run unless that sample list scope is successful. And so that's really important in this case, because if there's no sample list, then that last scope will fail. All right, so let's start with the difference between a library and a list. And here's where I'm going to go into SharePoint data that kind of breaks this down for you so that you can see how this works. There's something called SharePoint list template type. All right, this is part of the API for SharePoint and how its SDK works. And so these are available to anyone, whether you be a developer or whether you be a flow maker. You can use these SharePoint list template types. And you can see in this list here are all the different types. The 2 that we use the most are generic list and document library. So I'm just going to zoom into those 2. Whenever you want to create a SharePoint list or a SharePoint library or SharePoint anything, you need to refer to these members and look at the number, okay? So list are 100 and libraries are 101, Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my flow. I'm going to open the library scope, and you'll notice that this is sending an HTTP request to SharePoint. And it's very important that you use the HTTP request to SharePoint so that it's included in your seeded license, and also that you don't have to build a token for authentication. Because you're authenticated through Office 365 to that SharePoint site that you put up there, you won't need to add any authentication to this HTTP request. Now it asks, of course, for the site address, and I'm actually pulling that from the variable. And getting in the habit of pulling anything that repeats into a variable is a best practice that you can use, so that if I wanted to change the site, I wouldn't have to go in and edit my individual actions. I could simply just edit the variable, and now my flow adjusts to that new variable. Okay, so what you see is that all of these requests are post request, and post methods are used when you're updating something or adding something, right? Versus a get request, which is querying and asking a question. Okay, so we're using post in every case here, and I've included the URI. All the headers are the same. They're just accept application JSON. You can get away on these with a non-verbose, but we put the highest common denominator here so you won't run into any errors. And then on the bottom here is the body. And this is the part that you really need to understand. Let's look at it up close in our PowerPoint. All right, so when we're creating lists, we're using the endpoint API web lists. And then we're specifying what is the thing that we're going to be editing, right? And so we're in this type of SharePoint list. And that's why we went to that page to look at the SharePoint types so that we would know what type we needed, all right? So then this is a list, but the base template site is 101, which means it's going to be a document library. If I change that base template site type to something, let's go back to our documentation for a minute, something else, then it will be that thing that I use the number 4. So if I wanted to create a contacts list, I would use type 105. If I wanted to create a picture type library, I would use type 109. And so you would use the type that's appropriate to what you want to create. But again, sorry, my screen keeps jumping. You do want to choose your type based on your individual business goal. But I do recommend you stick with generic list or document library, because generic list and document library work for anything, just about anything. And they are objects that will persist in the modern workspace. There is a potential that some of these may be deprecated in the modern workspace, so you want to be aware that you want to stay up to date as to what's available in SharePoint. Okay, so we're going to go back to there, and you'll notice a few other things. Let's look at this up close as well. All right, so allow content types. So this is a setting that you use in SharePoint very often. You go into your settings and you turn on content types. Those of you that use content types extensively, you can choose to turn them on by default when you build these lists. I do that because then I have access to the content types that are available in SharePoint if I want to add them later. But you can completely remove this row. The default is allow content type is false, all right? And then we have the base template. Here's my description. Whatever I put here is the description that's going to show up in the actual library that's built. And this is the title of the library. Okay, so looking at that up close, if here in my flow, you'll notice that we've just given you something that you can say, but you can totally rename this library to something else and change the description, okay? This is a demo library focusing on base template number 101, okay? And so that's my new description. When I run this, you'll see that the library gets created in the base template type of 101, right? Now, fortunately enough, lists are created in the exact same way as libraries. FYI, everything in SharePoint is a list in some way or another. But here we're saying base template 100. So the only difference with creating a list versus a library is the base template number and samples list for base template number 100. And of course, you would use descriptions that fit your organization and titles that fit your organization. And what we're enumerating here, you'll be able to see on this page that we've linked you to on the list template type, all the things that you can include, and there's more than what you see here available. Okay, and that's that story. So now we've created a library. We've also created a list. Now note, the name of this list is hard-coded here. So if you want to change the name, you would change it in the title. If you want to change the description, you would change it there, and so on. Again, you can remove lines. You can remove the allow content type. Some of these are optional and some of them aren't. But you can remove these different lines and add other lines to customize to your needs. All right, so now we've got a list and a library. Now we're going to do our final scope, which is creating columns in the sample list. And basically, again, we're passing in the variable and we're posting. We've just changed our endpoint, okay? So if we go back to PowerPoint again, and we look at the create columns, they start by sample list, which is, so whatever the name of your list, you can get it by title. You can also get it by GUID if you prefer. This seems to be the simplest way. But remember, when you're getting it by title, make sure you put them in quotes and that you literally type the display name of your list here. All right. And then what it gives us back is not where we're going to keep going a little bit further. We're going to go ahead and get the list, but we're also going to add visibility to the fields because we're about to change the SharePoint feel. All right. Now, this data is in the SharePoint fields documentation. Let's take a peek at that real quick. So I'm going to go right here. And again, all these links are included in the description of the template as well as in the PowerPoint that I will share with you. So these represents all the field types, okay? And there are many, all right? Very commonly, we use the simple text field type, which is a number 2. And this is that single line of text, right? But you have other things like URL, which are hyperlink fields. You have multi-choice fields, which specifies one or more values for multi-choice. You also have lookup fields. You have integer fields, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you come here to determine what field type you need, and you can specify when you create the column what the data type for that column is. All right. So what we've given you is a few examples here. We've given you, and I'm just going to close all these up so we can kind of review all the different types we've given you. We've tried to give you like the most commonly used. We didn't exhaust it to every possible type, but we gave you like the most commonly used ones. So you have a column for date. You have actually a couple of those date columns. You have a location column, which is a single line of text. You have a office location, which is also a single line of text. You have a choice list type here, a status type, which is also a choice. You have a hyperlink type here, a Boolean, which is true, false, yes, no. And then we have a cost estimate column or currency type. And so if we look at these up close, you'll see that we're using the new endpoint, which points to the list. Now this would be important because if that list doesn't exist, this would break. Of course, you can actually use a dynamic token here if you want to iterate through a lot of lists. You can do that as well. Same headers, and then we get in here is where we're defining the column. So we start by what type of column it is. It's a date time column. Then we go into the kind, which was on that screen there that we saw here. Let's go back to here. The kind, which is date type. So this is 4 is the kind, okay? And you'll see in the body it says 4. And then the title of this field is start date, and the display format is 0. Where did we get display format from? Let's look at this page, and we're going to scroll all the way down. Let's see, maybe we go up. I will get you that link. So display format is dependent on whether it should be short, long date. What's the format of this date? And so I believe we do have that outlined in the SharePoint documentation. I'll try to add it to this PowerPoint so that you can see the different display formats for a date type field. And so you'll see that there. And just peeking back at the larger version of this in the PowerPoint here, we are using a date time field. We're saying it's kind 4, which is date time. We're saying its title is start date, and we're going to have a short, this is a short date format. So something similar to YY, sorry, short date time format. Okay, and maybe YYYY. I'll get that link and add it to you. Okay, so this is, you're specifying exactly what that column should look like. Let's look at a few of the other ones that will be popular. So in addition to date type, which you may use often, you may also want to use a choice list type. Okay, so notice the difference in that. This is a field choice, right? And then we give the column a status name. That's the name of the column. Field type kind is 6, which is choice. It is required. So again, you notice how I've added something here that might not have been in the other column, and that's because I'm saying I need this to be true. And then again, you can add that to any of your columns. Required is true. By default, required is false and everything except for title. And then finally, you have choices, and your choices are fall into a results key. And what you put in this array right here represents the words that would be found as the choices. Okay, really easy patterns. And the point of this template is to help you get to know these patterns. All right, let's look at the hyperlink type. Here, that's a field type of 11. And so all we need to do is let it know now this time we could just use SharePoint field and then specify the field kind. And then we gave it the title of URL. And let's look at the Boolean real quick. You'll notice that that is a field type of 8, and that's a title of tested. So this looks like a toggle switch on SharePoint, and it is reflected as true, false, or yes, no. Okay, and then finally, I think the last one is currency. Currency is really a number type that's specified down to show currency. And so again, if you go back to your field types, and if I do a search for currency, and I'm just doing Control F to find my fields, it will help you find them. So I just do Control F on the top of the screen, and then that'll help me go and find on the page where currency is mentioned. All right, so that's kind of a quick way to get around. And that is a type of 10. Versus a integer, which is a type of 1 and does not permit decimals, versus a number that's float. Okay, so you would pick the number type that best fits your business scenario, and that's basically the whole story. This enables you to set up a provisioning of SharePoint lists and columns for a new site you're creating. Oh, there was one more thing I wanted to explain to you, and I had skipped them. For every column, I also have this in here, which is a different endpoint slightly, and the endpoint is going to enable us to add the column to the default list view. All right. And here you'll notice that I've used the default list view name here. And then I've just said add the start date column. So the column that I created here is being added here. And I've put it right after that because it is dependent. Like this won't work if this column doesn't exist. And again, you can also use dynamic tokens to iterate through things if you want to. If you need to change what view you're adding this to, then you would replace all items with the appropriate view. And in this case, there is no body. The whole point is just to add it to the default view. When you add columns the way we're doing here, they do not get added to the default view. But if you do view, edit view, then you'll see that it exists. It's just not shown in the default view. And sometimes people will assume it's not there. So that's why you can go that extra step and add it to their default view, or you can make a very custom scenario where you decide what view you want to add it to, and you do that. All right, and that was the last thing on this template. I think this is a template that would be very useful for people who are using SharePoint. It's an alternative to PowerShell scripting. It's an alternative to other methods of adding list views, and probably more approachable for the citizen developer. So I wish you the best using this templates. Please do give us feedback in the community. If you have ideas on additional tutorial templates you would like to see, please add that to the community ideas forum, and make sure you tag it tutorial templates. Thank you and enjoy your Power Platform experience.